Welcome to Big Ten Country, first and foremost. Of course, our host James isn't here, but we're going to talk Northwestern football. And speaking of Northwestern, changes in the air as David Braun goes into his second season, along with the new Ryan Field under construction. The Wildcats players are getting a little throwback feel, i.e. Friday Night Lights, and Ethan Seagall, editor-in-chief of InsideNU, joins us to discuss the team playing alongside Lake Michigan this upcoming season and everything Cats. Ethan, how are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Excited to be talking about Northwestern, a little Big Ten action. We're at that part in the summer where I feel like I'm just craving football as we have flipped the calendar into August. It's officially football. Like football is going to be played this month.
Definitely. And I'm looking forward to it. And of course, due to proximity, and it's easy to get to a Northwestern game living in Chicago. So I'm always amped to talk Wildcats. Sometimes we think some of our listeners and followers may get mad because we talk a little bit about the state schools, but hey, it's just how it goes, basically. So look, I want to talk a little bit about the stadium or the facility alongside the lake. I don't know if we should call it a stadium, but I was looking at some of the interviews yesterday and watching the construction and the proximity, how close the fans will be. How do the players and the coaches feel about this season and necessarily not having Ryan Field to play in? Is there an advantage or disadvantage, would you say?
I honestly would lean more on the side of advantage. I mean, first of all, the venue is just going to be super cool. Anyone who's seen the pictures, having it be right on Lake Michigan, maybe opposing punters or even Northwestern punters will end up shanking a punt into the water, which would be very funny. But I think it'll be honestly an advantage, and in large part because the capacity is going to be limited to just 15,000. And Northwestern is the private school in the Big Ten, at least until some of the new teams joined, and often struggled to fill the 46,000 roughly capacity seats in Ryan Field. The smaller stadium size will honestly make it feel like more of a home field advantage, in my opinion. Sold out crowds every single week. And I think it'll feel a little bit louder without any empty seats in the stadium. Plus, they'll definitely have to adapt to some of the winds that are right there on the lake. And I think Northwestern will be better suited to do that than whoever's coming to town to play the Cats.
Well, last year, unfortunately, due to the hazing scandal, David Braun was thrust into the head coaching position. So I would think you don't necessarily have everything set in order, particularly like training, offseason regiment, the way you would do it, even though Pat Fitzgerald was successful with how he did in the past. What differences has David Braun said that he's done now that he's had a whole season to know how to run the program in the manner that he seems fit?
Yeah, so I mean, last year when David Braun got that head coaching title, there were less than 50 days until the season opener. So this offseason is his first real one at the helm where he's able to be the head coach for all of it. He brought in some coordinators, some of his own guys, some of his own transfers, rather than just inheriting a roster that was previously there for him. And it really is a big difference. This time last year, David Braun came in as the defensive coordinator. He knew all of the guys on the defense from spring practice. But I remember talking to Coach Braun last year and him saying, like, yeah, during this time, I'm absolutely still getting to know some of the guys on offense, learn about them as people, as players. And obviously, it's a whole world of difference this year with a team that really trusts Braun, really overachieved in 2023. So I think the expectations, even though Northwestern played well last season, are a little bit higher, especially within the program for this year.
What has he said about trying to be the CEO now, outside of course, initially getting a job as a defensive coordinator? As you mentioned, now he knows the players on the offensive side. How does he balance what he's doing with offense and defense, being primarily a defensive coach?
You know, at Big Ten Media Days, he talked about this a little bit, and he mentioned the importance of delegation, and he thanked all of the members of his staff, all three of his coordinators, including new offensive coordinator Zach Lujan, who is going to be calling plays on the offense this year. And I think the big difference from the David Braun we saw last year to now, as he had that interim label removed, is now the full-time head coach for a Big Ten program is, and he mentioned this at Big Ten Media Days, really starting to think more about the medium-term and long-term future rather than just we're going to go out and we're going to try and stomp our opponents tomorrow, trying to think of everything in more of a 2 or 3 year plan about that recruiting, about player development, rather than looking at just what's ahead of you. And of course, he mentioned that's important to keep in mind too. The goal of college football is to win games. That happens 1 week at a time. But he really has had to develop into more of that, as you mentioned, CEO type. And the program is now in his reins as much as he would defer and says it's we, not me.
Look, you mentioned OC Lujan. What it seems the emphasis on David Braun's offense and defense compared to Pat Fitzgerald's offense and defense? Is there anything where, for instance, the quarterbacks have been moving out. He can't stop that. Or, you look at the mobility of the quarterback last year, or just as far as running, what does he want to do different to sign his name and make this his team when it comes to the offensive and defensive style of play?
I think it's actually been a Can you hear me? Sorry, I think I might have cut out for a second there.
I can hear you. I can hear you now.
I think it's actually been a little bit hard to tell in terms of what's been different between the Braun and Fitzgerald eras in year one. Fitzgerald was definitely known for a lot of fourth down aggressiveness, and I would say we saw a little bit more of a conservative approach at times during last season. But I think because of how fast the turnaround was before that start of the season last year, we weren't really able to see Braun develop what his identity was going to look like for his team until about midway through the season. It's definitely still a Northwestern, Midwestern, blue-collar defense that is going to try and set the tone, be really physical. On offense, they're going to try and run the ball, really kind of kick you in the mouth and establish that tone as well. But it's really interesting, the coordinator hire this year, especially on the offensive side of the ball, as I mentioned, with Zach Lujan, because I think that's where we'll start to see a little bit of a departure from a lot of the play colors that Pat Fitzgerald had during his tenure. Lujan is definitely one of the younger types who is all about getting his players into space, lots of play action, and that's not something we saw a lot under the coordinator Fitzgerald era.
What do they bring? So, for instance, and correct me if I'm wrong, you look at what took place, and I'm not trying to sit there and sit on the unfortunate instance of allegations that took place in the past, but no one expected Northwestern to go 8-5. And was that an instance of being galvanized by something, or is that showing us the direction of consistency perhaps that we'll see under David Braun? And you can't know and predict the future, but you could hope that it could be consistency, because even under Pat Fitzgerald, you have ebbs and flows of Northwestern being a team that's playing well and then being a team that's bottom of the Big Ten.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was definitely more of it being galvanized. I think even when Pat Fitzgerald was slated to be the head coach in 2023, this team was not expected to do that well last year. And once David Braun took over, I mean, people were talking about this team as a potential 0-12 candidate at the very bottom of the barrel of the Big Ten, considering they went 1-11 the year before and then lost 4 players to the NFL, including Peter Skoronski, a first-round pick to the Titans. This team's expectations were in the absolute gutter last year. So it really was so impressive. After that week 1 loss at Rutgers, the team just slowly started to build confidence and momentum. There was definitely an element of being galvanized, trying to prove a lot of people wrong. It was really a team mentality, and they had to shut out kind of the outside world last year, for better and for worse. And it allowed this team to really overperform, and then they really rallied around David Braun. I can definitely remember after the Wisconsin game where they went and they upset the Badgers on the road in a venue that the Northwestern really hasn't won at in a while. Every single player in the locker room was saying, let's take this interim tag off. It's time to make this guy the head coach. And Northwestern ended up doing it shortly after. So it was definitely a special season, but I think you're right to point out that the expectations preseason were certainly pretty low. So while there's certainly some room for a little bit of inconsistency this year, and I'm sure we'll delve into some of those things, last year definitely felt like the start of something under the David Braun era.
Let's delve into some of those things, Ethan. Let's talk at the quarterback position. You got Mike Wright taking over for Brendan Sullivan with a similar skill set. Do you think Jack Loush will be the guy who's going to take over the quarterback position, and who perhaps fit this team best moving into this upcoming season?
Well, so Northwestern has been in this absolute carousel with the quarterback position, dating back to the time where Clayton Thorson was playing in the Big Ten, where they've just been bringing in transfers, and they've had a different week 1 starter every single year since 2019. It's just been a litany of guys, of course, including last year's Ben Bryant, who played really well down the stretch for the team. Brendan Sullivan filled in a little bit in relief. Everyone expected him to be the guy going into this year. Transfers out to Iowa, so they bring in Mike Wright, formerly of Vanderbilt and Mississippi State, and they really like Mike Wright. He has that SEC experience, some dual threat ability. That being said, so far in the offseason, everything they have said has been that it will be a true quarterback competition. So we are still monitoring. So between Mike Wright and Jack Loush, both bring a little bit more of that dual threat ability than we saw with Ben Bryant last year. And both definitely have the ability to fit Zach Lujan's scheme, but it's certainly up in the air. And it is definitely one of the 1 or 2 biggest questions facing Northwestern football this season is what type of play they get from the signal caller.
Who's going to replace Cam Johnson's production between Bryce Kurtz and AJ Henning, or any other receiver that may flash this upcoming season?
That's a great question that I really wish I knew the answer to it. It's definitely been something that I've been wondering about. There are a few guys in that wide receiver room that they're definitely excited about. That includes Calvin Johnson. That includes some other guys like Frank Covey. That being said, all those guys are kind of on the smaller side. And with Kurtz and Henning on the field, Northwestern would have a very small receiver room. Something in Zach Lujan's previous stop at South Dakota State, they played with a lot of 12 personnel, multiple tight ends on the field. And Northwestern's tight end room, despite being one of the more veteran rooms on the team, is definitely more unproven in terms of past production. So we could see some of that receiving vacancy filled by some of the tight ends, including Thomas Gordon. But that is also maybe the other biggest question that I was just kind of alluding to is where some of that kind of outside production comes from, aside from Bryce Kurtz and AJ Henning, who we know are going to have big roles in this offense.
Ethan, sticking with that, when you said that there's questions, so on the offensive side, where do you have the least amount of questions? What grouping or players do you expect to play well and can be dependable this upcoming season?
It's kind of a weird answer to that question, but I think the thing I have the least amount of questions about is the overall scheme, which is a weird thing to say despite there being a new offensive coordinator. But based on Zach Lujan's past, based on talking a little bit to AJ Henning, to running back Cam Porter at Big Ten Media Days, they emphasize that he is all about getting players in space. And we're going to see a lot of that. And I think that manifests itself into two different ways. I feel really good about the team's ability to kind of adapt the play calling and the scheme to its best players, those being Kurtz, Henning, Porter. Those guys are going to get the ball a lot. The thing that's kind of holding that back is, one, what does that quarterback play look like? And number two, what the offensive line looks like. That is definitely a big question. And Lujan's scheme should be able to kind of take away some of the stress from the offensive line. We'll see probably a lot of quick game, a lot of RPO. It will certainly be a run-heavy offense, considering the venue where they'll be playing a lot of their games, as well as just kind of what the running back room looks like. Cam Porter brings some veteran experience. They're really excited about some younger, speedier guys in Caleb Komalafe and Joseph Hyman. So that's where I have the least amount of questions on the offense, is where I'd say.
What about the offensive line? Who's perhaps the most dependable offensive lineman going into the season, in your opinion?
The offensive line is definitely a work in progress, and I think Coach Braun would probably say the same thing. They lost their best offensive lineman from last year to Michigan in the transfer portal in Josh Preeb, and I think they're still looking for answers at all five spots. I think we can assume we'll see guys like Ben Rather or Caleb Tiernan somewhere in that grouping on the offensive line. The center position is definitely up for debate. I think it remains to be seen who will be playing there. But it's a huge question, considering this is a team that wants to be able to, as I said earlier, set that physical tone, kick you in the mouth. And it kind of remains to be seen whether they actually have the personnel to be able to do that on a consistent basis.
Sticking with the trenches, flipping over to the defensive side, the defensive line, and even though David Braun being a defensive coach, he only had one season, and then he had to take over, of course, before the season started as head coach. What do you expect from the defensive line? Most of the rotation is still intact.
I think the defensive line is maybe the strongest position group on the team, which is a crazy thing to say, considering that last year going into the season might have been the single biggest question mark. And maybe that speaks to Coach Braun, maybe that speaks to some of the position coaches. But this year, they're like 7, 8, or 9 guys deep. And so we're going to see kind of those hockey style rotations. I think there's like 7 or 8 guys who have a chance to finish with 2 or 3 or more sacks, who are just going to be constantly rotating. Obviously, there are some veterans in the group, of course, Sean McLaughlin, Richie Haggerty, but also you have some more unproven guys who started to burst onto the scene last year. Anto Saka off the edge is maybe the most physical and athletic potential there of anyone in the group. Carmine Bastone is kind of a guy that Coach Braun has loved to talk about as a guy who really came into the year who he expected nothing from, and really came onto the scene by the end of the year as kind of a exemplar of what that Northwestern mentality is all about, as he was making really big plays for the Cats down the stretch last season. He's going to be playing more this year, and that's a group that I feel really good about going into the season, both from a pass rush and a run defense perspective.
And I love that. And of course, if the defensive line is creating pressure and also tackling the running back, that would let us know that the linebackers should be freed up. So expectations for the linebackers, but you can go ahead and throw the DBs in there. Are those, you mentioned the defensive line being the strongest groups. Where would you rate those two positional groups then behind the defensive line, strongest to weakest?
I would say the defensive backs come into the year a little bit stronger than the linebackers, although I think they're pretty close. The linebackers lose a huge contributor in Bryce Gallagher. His brother Blake Gallagher had played at Northwestern before him, and this is the first time in a long time that there will not be a Gallagher lining up at linebacker for the Cats. And he was also wearing the green dot for the defense. So even though Northwestern returns Xander Mueller, who had a fantastic season last year, was a Big Ten honorable mention, has been named to a lot of preseason watch lists already this season, and all expectations are that he will be the best player on the defense this season. After Mueller, there are definitely some question marks, especially at that Mike linebacker spot. There's kind of a training camp battle going on right there. And that is also the battle for who is going to be calling plays for the defense. So that is definitely something that I know Northwestern fans have been monitoring. Defensive back-wise, I thought Northwestern got really good play out of their defensive backs for the most part last season, although they lost some guys in the transfer portal this offseason, losing both Garnett Hollis and Jakeem Joseph, transferring out to West Virginia. That being said, Northwestern did a lot of rotating its defensive backs last year, so a lot of guys did get snaps. They're really excited about Coco Azuma being back on the field. He's been a little bit injury-plagued these past few seasons. Devin Turner really burst onto the team last season, is a really hard hitter who has kind of an ability to be used in kind of like a chess piece on defense, plays in the nickel. Sometimes you'll see him at safety, and man, he really hits hard, also is able to hold his own in coverage. So I feel pretty solid about the defensive back group, even though just they'll always be tested, especially with some of those new West Coast teams coming into the conference. We're going to try and air the ball out a little bit, really test these Northwestern defensive backs. Remains to be seen if that can actually be done at the Lakeside venue with some swirling winds. But I would say both of those groups I feel good, not great about going into the season, being the defensive backs and linebackers.
The swirling winds is really going to be interesting, particularly during punts and kickoffs. But I'm happy you mentioned the green dot, because I'd be remiss if I didn't say, with tech coming in with tablets and being able to communicate with players, how has the adjustment been for the coaching staff and the players so far getting to these new adjustments with tech coming into the future? The Big Ten.
So it's definitely an adjustment, but Northwestern actually has the advantage of they were able to use that tech during their bowl game last season in the Las Vegas Bowl against Utah. It was the first time they had used it. And I mentioned at the time, Bryce Gallagher was the one who was wearing that helmet tech, calling plays for the defense. And Coach Braun kind of talked about how it's kind of an easy tendency to be wanting to give your players as much information as possible pre-snap, pointing out all of the possible things that they're seeing on the play, what could go wrong, where players need to be, what to be calling out. And actually something that he's had to learn early on, especially after Bryce Gallagher told him, whoa, that is too much information, is kind of how to cut back and give the right amount of information pre-snap and kind of go and let the players do their thing. This is obviously such a meticulous coaching staff during the week in terms of scheming, in terms of preparation for their opponents. And they're definitely going to use that technology to their advantage. But Northwestern, kind of like every other program, is going to have to kind of work around that learning curve of figuring out how much to say, how to use that helmet technology. But Northwestern definitely has the advantage of having used it, even if it was in a one-game sample size from before.
I'll get you out on this. Realistic expectations. This is one of the tougher schedules in the Big Ten when I look at it. I mean, you look at Duke at that second game, and I know a lot of people may not pay attention, but Duke is a good football team now. And then you have, of course, Maryland. We have to see what that offense can do now that Tale is gone. But Wisconsin, then Iowa, Ohio State 2 weeks later, and Michigan. That's a hard fought battle towards the end of the season. Realistic expectations for the record this upcoming season, Ethan.
You mentioned it. I mean, the schedule is definitely a gauntlet. The Ohio State, Michigan in back-to-back weeks, also playing Washington early in the season. I mean, those are the two teams who played for the national championship last year, and then the one that comes into this season ranked second, projected to win the Big Ten by a lot of prognosticators. So there are definitely some games that I think are easy to pencil in as potential losses. But I do expect this team to be hovering around bowl eligibility, somewhere between that 5 to 7 win mark. They were able to go 7-5 in the regular season last year. I don't think that's out of the picture for this year, despite the tough schedule. You mentioned that early season battle against Duke. Maybe something going in Northwestern's favor. It's at home this year. They've played Duke plenty of times in the past few seasons. It is at the Lakeside facility during this season. And on top of that, lots of changes to the Duke coaching staff, to the quarterback room with Riley Leonard transferring out. So that's early in the season for the Blue Devils, potentially a trip-up game for Duke. Northwestern, it wouldn't be shocking to see them start the season 3-0 against Miami of Ohio, Duke, and Eastern Illinois, and maybe pick up even a fourth win at Washington. Obviously a really tough venue to play at, but if you're talking about teams that have coaching changes and quarterback changes, Washington is certainly among the biggest question marks in the country this year of what that team will look like coming off such a successful season in 2023. And then you get into the real Big Ten gauntlet. A lot of teams Northwestern is used to playing. You mentioned Maryland, Wisconsin, Iowa, Purdue. Those are foes Northwestern is certainly familiar with, but bring new challenges every year. Luke Fickell and his squad, I expect Wisconsin to be a lot tougher of an opponent this year. Iowa, maybe that'll be a revenge game for Brendan Sullivan, depending on how that quarterback battle shakes out in Iowa. And then the big game at the end of the year, of course, the battle for the Land of Lincoln Trophy against Illinois. Both the Ohio State and Illinois games are going to be played at Wrigley Field at the end of the season, which provides another unique venue. And Northwestern's played at that venue a few times in the past year, so they'll definitely be a little bit used to it. But to answer your question, if I had to give a prediction, I would say 6-6.
All right. Check him out, editor-in-chief of InsideNU, Ethan Seagall. Ethan, look forward to talking to you down the line when the season hits up, man. We definitely appreciate you joining us here in Big Ten Country.
Thank you so much for having me. It always gets me excited to talk about Northwestern football.
Congrats, you finished the video. If you want to build on that success, download the NBC Sports Chicago app. It's got highlights, exclusive insights, and push alerts tailored to you. Everything you need to be a real Chicago sports fan. Download it now.